And yet, here's something that I think we need to think about. Whenever we consider these possibilities, we need to constantly be mindful of the fact that we love to scare the hell out of a film.
Warning, this is not entertainment.
In part number 1 of the History We Were Never Taught, we touched on a lot of subjects that have been, for the most part, expunged from history. Things that have never really been taken seriously as far as being included in the historical record, even though they do come from a source that is very much mainstream and a source that is very much relied on to build that structure of the historical record. Of course, I'm talking about Herodotus. He was the source material for the first part of this podcast, and he gave us most of the framework for what we know today about the conflict between the Greeks and the Persians for the better part of a century and a half, the 400s and the 500s BC. But not everybody loves Herodotus equally. As I mentioned in that first episode, some people call him the father of lies. They say that it's impossible to parse the chaff from the wheat, and therefore we need to discredit Herodotus entirely. There are others who take a more level-headed approach and say that Herodotus is as genuine and sincere and honest as he possibly can be, and the places that are a little bit more fantastical, well, those are stories that have been passed down second and third hand, that Herodotus is just recounting things he heard that were old wives' tales or folklore. And in some cases, that's true. Herodotus does tell you when he's heard stories second or third hand and does consider some of those things to be folklore, but there are other things. There are things that seem so fantastical and so out of this world, yet Herodotus sticks to them and says these are plausible and these things did happen. We talked about a lot of those things in that first episode, some of which are a little more outlandish than others, but in any case, we presented them and we said, what if these things are true? What if there's more to the story here? Just to recap, we talked about the trials and the adventures of Heracles, better known as Hercules in the West. We talked about how Heracles went up into the land that is now Eastern Europe, all the way up into what is now Russia, and he completed some of his great feats there. But on his way, he had some encounters with strange characters, one of them being an echidna-type character, half woman, half serpent, who the Scythian people, they traced their lineage back to Heracles and this echidna woman. Now, of course, every culture has its own mythological origin story, and I'm not saying that we should take that seriously, but that's just one kernel on a stalk that's filled with so many strange tales. In that same story, Herodotus tells us about the one-eyed Arimaspians, who are mentioned in other texts as well. He's not the only person who wrote about these horse lords. They were horse warriors from the steppe, and they basically, well, they were one-eyed warriors. They were said to have one eye in the middle of their head, like a cyclops. They rode on horseback, and they made war with their neighbors. Other cultures wrote about them. Said north of the Arimaspians, there were griffins, creatures who had the body of a lion, the head of an eagle, and that these griffins guarded gold. And there are known gold mines in this territory. Make of that what you will. And we left off with a strange and mysterious people who were said to live so far north that it was dark for long periods of time. I take this to be a reference to approaching the Arctic Circle, where the sun is never very high in the sky, and therefore it's dark for long periods of time. These people were called the Hyperboreans. And we closed the episode there. Herodotus doesn't give us too much information about the Hyperboreans because there really isn't that much to give. Obviously, he never traveled to these lands, and everything he knows about the Hyperboreans is second and third hand. But the reason why we don't discredit it is because so many other Greeks claim to have contact with these Hyperboreans. We have found artifacts, we've found writings that reference these people that lived to the north. So we know that there were people there, and that these people did periodically have some sort of interaction with the Greeks. Herodotus says that they celebrated the same religious holidays. They all worshipped the same deities, which is fascinating in and of itself because whether you're in Persia, whether you're in Greece, or whether you're in the Ionian Greek states, which is modern-day Turkey, you'll find the same deities being worshipped. You'll find Dionysus, Apollo, Zeus, Athena. You'll have variants in names of these deities, but for the most part, you're going to have the same pantheon of gods across the Middle East and across that part of southeastern and central Europe, all the way up, if you believe the stories, into what is now modern-day Russia and even Siberia. So these people, these Hyperboreans, we know that they lived to the north, that it was very cold there, that they were a mysterious people, and for the most part, they seemed to be separate unto themselves. They were never conquered by anyone else. But if you recall, at the end of that episode, I said that there was a connection between these mysterious people known as the Hyperboreans and the modern day, that history may not be so distant in some cases, and this being one of those examples. Well, in part 2, we're going to examine a particular incident. We're going to try to draw parallels, more as detectives in this episode than historians. But before we get to that account, that strange and mysterious incident that happened not too long ago, I'd like to talk about some other fingerprints, some other evidence that might lend further support. So when the jury goes into deliberation in this hypothetical courtroom that we're setting up, they won't just have this story that I'm about to tell you. They'll also have these other accounts, these other pieces of evidence to look to as they try to determine the merits of the case that's been presented and laid before them and make a judgment on it one way or the other. One of those pieces of evidence, one of those fingerprints, if you will, is from an incident that happened, again, relatively recently. This was shortly after the end of World War II. And one of my astute Patreon supporters actually pointed this out before I had disclosed any of this or any script or outline of this episode. He actually reached out and asked if this was going to tie in somehow to what we were leading up to in part 1 as we were recounting the history of Herodotus. And that account, that story, is the story of Admiral Richard Byrd. For those of you who aren't familiar with Admiral Byrd, he was a pilot and he was an explorer who functioned primarily as a pilot for the military in the 1940s and the 1950s. In 47, Admiral Byrd took several expeditions into Antarctica. And these were flyovers for the most part, examining and exploring the terrain. If you recall, during World War II, most of the global powers had some sort of an interest and a presence in Antarctica. Now, there are any number of reasons for why that could be the case. Some of the most crackpot or outlandish theories are that we were in contact with extraterrestrials and, we were basically managing those relationships off the grid quietly in Antarctica. Others say that the Nazis were building bases. Others say that the Nazis were building bases there and that they had a strong presence there and that they were doing military experiments, or maybe that's where they were experimenting with their flying saucers. In any case, it's undebatable at this point. Records do show that the Germans were constantly sailing ships down to Antarctica in the 1940s. The Americans were there, the French were there, the British were there, and the Soviets may have even been there in a larger scale as well. So you have to ask the question, why? What is the reason for that? Is this military strategy, missile placement? Was it something else entirely? Well, according to the apocryphal diary of Admiral Richard Byrd, which was released posthumously, this came out and was widely circulated after his death, which is important to note. During Operation High Jump, which was this expedition to explore Antarctica in 1947, Admiral Byrd apparently found something that was an anomaly, something that he did not expect to find. He recounts, allegedly, in one part of the journal, in an entry from February 19th of 1947, he says, quote, "We're crossing over the small mountain range and still proceeding northward as best can be ascertained. Beyond the mountain range is what appears to be a valley with a small river or a stream running through the center portion. There should be no green valley below, but something is definitely wrong and abnormal here. We should be over ice and snow, but to the port side are great forests growing on the mountain slopes. Our navigation instruments are still spinning. The gyroscope is oscillating back and forth." Now that's fantastic in and of itself. If this diary can be proven to be credible, that one entry alone would spark all sorts of explorers and investigators to try to get to the bottom of that and figure out what the case is there. Because the story all of us have been pitched is that Antarctica is a block of ice and that there is no green pasture whatsoever there. Admiral Byrd is saying that that wasn't the case in 1947. Now, he goes on to say in future entries that there are far stranger things going on in Antarctica and the South Pole than we could have expected. He says that he actually ends up, and I won't read this entry, but in another future entry, he says that he actually ends up landing his plane and that he's taken to meet an individual called the Master. And this Master is the leader of a group of people who actually dwell underground. This is a race of people who were said to have made contact with the Nazis in the 1940s, and that's what sparked the interest for all of the great powers to start going down there. And these people actually let their presence be made known at that point because they realized that humanity had stumbled upon nuclear power and atomic bombs. And once that happened, they felt like they had to intervene. And this is allegedly, according to this diary, this is where the origin for UFO technology comes from, that it's actually something that has been reverse engineered from these individuals who dwelt underground in Antarctica. And this individual known as the Master basically, he gives that famous talk that so many people who claim to have alien encounters give, which is, basically humanity needs to course correct or it's going to destroy itself. We're here to intervene and protect you to the best of our ability from doing that very thing. And Admiral Byrd supposedly meets these individuals. They warn him to basically act now, convince your governments to change course, otherwise the world will not exist in the not too distant future. And those diary entries, among others, but those two primarily, have created an entire framework of conspiratorial thought where people have started to frame these ideas about, well, what was the real meaning behind governments exploring the South Pole? And on top of that, what do they know about the UFO encounters, the Foo Fighters and the saucers that started to appear during the 1940s? What are they trying to keep secret about underground bases and underground civilizations possibly? And how does that tie into ancient history? How does it tie into what we talked about in part one? Whether Admiral Byrd's diary can be taken seriously as a resource or not, we need to realize that he's not the only one who's given us stories like this before. Even up as recently as the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, beginning in 2003, we've had people who have told us of outlandish tales of military soldiers who have encountered in the Middle East giants who live in caves, literally 7 to 10 foot tall humanoid beings, often with reddish hair and blue eyes, who are said to still inhabit these lands. Some of you listening to this podcast probably listen to Steve Quayle, and Steve Quayle has talked about this many times over the years. But I remember hearing stories about that back when I was in high school in the early 2000s, shortly after we went to the Middle East. And you would hear these stories and these raw interviews of soldiers who claimed, to be going on missions in the desert, in the Iraqi desert, and they would stumble upon evidence of these freakishly large hominid-type creatures who were said to dwell underground. Stories like that have existed, through the ages, and they may be few and far between, but they're there. There's fingerprints and evidence of them pretty much through every eon or every age of man, as far back as we can trace our written history. So Admiral Byrd's story, and I personally don't put a lot of stock in this idea of the apocryphal diary that was published after his death, particularly because of the accounts of the Master and the alien gospel that we so often get. It just sounds too good to be true, almost too forced. Not to say I couldn't be wrong. Of course I could be wrong about that, but it corroborates with other stories we've heard over the years about similar types of creatures and similar types of dwellings, that it forces us to have to look at it seriously and say, what if? What if this is a theory that explains so many things that have gone unsolved over the years? I mean, we still don't have a very credible or plausible explanation for so many of these UFO sightings that seem to mysteriously take place for whatever reason around military bases. How many times do we have to hear tales about ICBMs being launched and then being disabled in the sky by a small glowing object that seems to violate the laws of physics and move faster than any known aircraft that our military has? How many times do astronauts have to come on, like Edgar Mitchell, and tell us that they've seen ships and crafts that are clearly not made by the American government or any other government for that matter? And despite the naysayers, we do have video footage of many of these things. And we just found out in the past several months that Harry Reid, when he was the majority leader of the Senate, actually was, leading investigations into these things. I mean, our government takes this very seriously. There is high strangeness that has taken place that centers around and testifies to some of these strange tales, like what we read in Admiral Byrd's diary. But even more so than the UFO story, most people look to Admiral Byrd's diary for evidence of a hollow Earth. And for those of you who have heard that theory or familiar with that theory, many have gone to great lengths to try and debunk it. It often gets tied in with flat Earth, which I think the two should be treated separately entirely. But the hollow Earth idea doesn't necessarily mean that the Earth is an eggshell and that the entire middle of it is empty, like Journey to the Center of the Earth or some children's story like that. It just means that there's caverns, there's places that are hollowed out, large hollowed out sections wherein civilization could thrive, albeit an underground civilization that would probably have either its own light source and water supply, which we do have underground water supply, so light source would be the primary thing, or it would have to have some sort of artificial mechanism to sustain itself. It's not too far-fetched to assume that exists or that it could be built and designed. Of course, our governments have that on a small scale. Now we have underground bases all over the United States. The Soviets, former Soviet Union, had them all over the place, and now the Russians utilize those to their benefit. Most nations have some sort of underground continuation of government plan, kind of like Fallout or something like that, where society could thrive and continue on for years if it had to. I mean, we have underground bases here in America where they have Dunkin' Donuts. So this is no joke. You can look this up. In Pennsylvania, on the borderlands between Pennsylvania and Maryland, there's an underground base where government officials will be evacuated if there's ever a nuclear event. And in that base, there's a post office, there's a Dunkin' Donuts, there's all sorts of amenities and things that you would see, in the above ground surface world. And yet we just don't talk about it because it's out of sight, out of mind. But these things exist. So the idea that an advanced civilization hundreds or thousands of years ago could have gone underground and built a world for them beneath the surface, it's really not that far-fetched. We're doing it now, guys. I mean, it's happening now. There's a lot of potential there, but there's no rock-solid evidence to say that's the case. Again, it's fingerprints. But there's one incident. There's one event that happened in the 20th century that I think is the closest thing to a smoking gun that we have, and perhaps will ever have. Something that says maybe these stories that Herodotus told us about these lands, well, maybe there's something to them. Well, it just so happens in 1959, one of the strangest unsolved mysteries of modern times, perhaps all time, took place in this very area. That area being the Ural Mountains, the place where if you follow the maps, you'll find that is ground zero of where these Hyperboreans were said to have lived. In 1959, the Dyatlov Pass incident happened. For those who don't know what Dyatlov Pass is or what happened to that incident, I'll tell you now. It's a murder mystery. It's a murder mystery that involves 9 college students who were killed under very, very mysterious circumstances while they were hiking through this area, the Ural Mountains. And that area where they went missing, that area where they died, it's called Dyatlov Pass in memory of this event and their expedition leader, Igor Dyatlov. He was a 23-year-old ski hiker, and his team of 8 experienced hikers, who were also his fellow students, they all studied at the Ural Polytechnical Institute. They went out and they embarked on a cross-country ski trip. They were trying to get to one of the high peaks in the northern Ural Mountains. And I won't go through all of the details. You can read this in very grisly detail if you would like. And I highly encourage you to actually do that if you have access to a computer or the internet while you're listening to this, if for nothing else than to look at the pictures, just so that you can try to wrap your head around just how strange this incident was. And after I explain this incident, and hopefully after you look at these photos, I want you to think about Herodotus, and I want you to think about what we talked about in part 1. Getting back to the story of Dyatlov Pass. None of these hikers, after they set out on this expedition, spoiler alert, none of them were ever seen again, at least not alive. From what was recovered from the scene, the crime scene, if you will, cameras were recovered, personal diaries were recovered from the site. Investigators were able to use that material to piece together a storyline, to figure out where the hikers were at key points in their journey, what decisions they were making, how they were feeling, and ultimately take a glimpse into the events that transpired on the night of their deaths. On February 1st in 1959, this group was pushing through a hostile cold winter night, and they were at the base of this mountain that they were trying to get to. But they were hit with a snowstorm, and that storm ripped through the narrow pass. It just was unbearable, and it made it impossible for them to move on. So with decreasing visibility that caused them to lose their sense of direction, they accidentally deviated their course a bit west, and rather than getting to their destination at the base of the mountain, they found themselves on the slope near the top of a nearby mountain. Well, this mountain is known as Kholat Syakhl, and it means, in the native language, dead mountain, or the mountain of the dead. The indigenous people there, the Mansi people, consider this to be a sacred place, and it's a place where they do not venture. There's alleged to be strange activity bordering on supernatural activity that takes place in this area, according to the Mansi people. They say that the spirit of the mountain and the spirit of the dead who have died on that mountain inhabit this place. People have reported seeing strange lights in this area. The Mansi have said people have gone missing in this area. But another part that often gets overlooked is that there are stories of giants in this area. For those of you who are familiar with Yeti sightings, many of those take place in this area as well. The Yeti being the Siberian or the Russian version of Bigfoot, more or less. A tall, hairy beast, usually with, in pop culture, white fur, fangs, claws, very big, not unlike the Bigfoot stories here in the West. Strange coincidence as it may be, there are many Yeti sightings that take place in this area of the Ural Mountains. So due to the weather, and since it was virtually impassable and they didn't want to lose their direction any more than they already had, when the team realized their mistake, they decided that they would make camp here. For one, they didn't want to lose altitude, so they weren't going to backtrack, and this would help them adjust to the higher altitude, and once the storm passed, they could easily get back on track. They still had a relatively good idea of where they were. But it was on this solitary mountainside that all 9 of these hikers would meet their fate. Yes, all 9 of them would die. Before they went out and embarked on this journey, Dyatlov told his sports club that he and his team would send them a telegram as soon as they returned from the hike. But when January 26 rolled around, there was still no communication from the hikers. A search party was mounted. Now, as I told you, the storm happened at the beginning of February, so they were already behind schedule when this happened. So the volunteer force had already sent out. They found the campsite just a couple of days later. After the volunteers got there, the Army and police investigators were sent in to determine what had happened to the students. The volunteers quickly realized that something foul was afoot. They realized that this was not just exposure to hypothermia, but something very strange had happened here. The police investigators intended to find a simple scene when they arrived. I mean, you get a bunch of volunteer hikers and ski club members who go out. They say they saw something strange. They found some dead bodies in the snow. The Army and the police investigators are expecting, okay, it's a bunch of kids who bit off more than they could chew, underestimated the conditions and the climate, and they got what was coming to them by getting exposed and caught in a snowstorm. However, when the investigators actually got there, they would find something that would haunt their nightmares for the rest of their days. They discovered 8 or 9 sets of footprints from the team almost right away. Some of them were clearly visible, others were harder to make out. The trajectory of these footsteps seemed to be scattered and scrambled. Some of them seemed to go forward and then backtrack. They would seem to move very quickly with larger strides, and then they would slow down. Some of the footprints looked like there was evidence of a scuffle or some sort of a conflict. You would see footprints in large circles stomped on the ground, and then the bodies. Many of the individuals had nothing on. They would find a sock, a single shoe on some of their feet. Some of them were completely naked, which is a sign of hypothermia. But they didn't find all of the bodies together. As they followed some of the footprints, some of those tracks led to nearby woods, almost a mile away from the camp. Keep in mind that the night of the death of these hikers was a blizzard. It would have been difficult to venture just a few hundred feet from camp, let alone nearly a mile. At the forest edge, under a large cedar, the investigators discovered the remains of a small fire. The hikers appeared to have built it. And around that fire were the first 2 bodies they found. Those 2 bodies belonged to Yuri Kvinashenko, 23, and Yuri Doroshenko, 21. Despite the temperatures of negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit on the night of their deaths, both of these men's bodies were found shoeless and wearing only their underwear. The strange thing to point out here is that they had attempted to build a fire. If they were out of their wits, if hypothermia had set in and they had gone mad and ripped their clothes off, why would they have made an effort to build a fire? The evidence seemed to suggest that these men were frightened from their camp. Before they could put their clothing on, they had to escape, and they ran as fast and as far as they could. Something frightened them so much that it was nearly a mile in underwear and socks before they stopped to make a fire. The next 3 bodies that were found were all clustered together near that cedar tree that I mentioned, and one of those bodies was Dyatlov himself, the team leader. The other 2 were young females, aged 24 and aged 23. If you look at the photos of their bodies, they're fully clothed, but they appear to be in a defensive position. A couple of them are huddled on the ground in what looks to be a fetal position almost, as if they were trying to protect their vital organs and extremities. Dyatlov's body was found laying face down in the snow. Sure, their deaths were odd, like the others, but these were by no means inexplicable, like the 2 bodies that were found nearly naked around the fire. These students had clearly died from hypothermia. There was almost no doubt about it. There was no indication of severe external damage to their bodies. Even though they appeared to be in a defensive position, it didn't seem to be that strange. It wasn't until the final 4 bodies were found that the mystery deepened. And the kicker is this: those 4 bodies wouldn't be found for another 2 months. When the final 4 hikers were discovered, they were found in a ravine nearly 75 meters deeper into the woods than the cedar tree. And it was a significantly different cause of death. These 4 had fatal injuries. And by fatal injuries, I mean that their skulls were crushed. 2 of them, Nikolai Thibu-Brignali, had a significant skull damage, and Lyudmila Dubinina, aged 20, and Semyon Zolotaryov, aged 38, had major chest fractures. So one had his skull caved in, the other 2 had their chest caved in, and it was quickly determined by the investigators that these injuries could have only been caused by immense force. It was comparable to a car crash, one of the on-site investigators said. Now, it was also determined that these injuries were sustained prior to death. In fact, they were the cause of death. The 2 that had their chest caved in died of, obviously, punctured organs and internal bleeding. And the young man who had his skull crushed died from the impact of that blow. These were not injuries that were sustained by scavenger animals or something like that after the fact. The most gruesome part of this entire Dyatlov Pass incident was Dubnina, who was missing her tongue and her eyes. This female hiker was found with most of her facial tissue missing. And I don't want to sound too graphic. I know we do have some young listeners, but it's an important part of the story here. Her tongue, her eyes, parts of her lips, as well as the facial tissue, and fragments of her skull bone were all missing. Now, many said that this could obviously be the result of scavenger animals and that these tissue items could have been eaten by a predator after the body had been exposed for several days. However, farther analysis of the trauma would show that these injuries appeared to be sustained at the time of death. Adding to the strangeness, the body of the 4th hiker who was in this group was found right next to the young woman who had lost her tongue and her lips and her eyes, and he had all of those things. So there was no damage done to the fleshy parts of his face, yet he was right next to a body that had those things removed. So you would think that if this was a scavenger animal or a pack of coyotes, wolves, something like that, then it would have been the same outcome for both bodies, but that was not the case. There was evidence that the hikers used clothes of the people who died first. So some of these hikers had on clothing that belonged to some of the other people in the expedition. Dubnina, she had a foot that was found wrapped in a piece of Krivonishenko's wool pants. And then in turn, Zolotaryov, one of the other hikers, was found wearing Dubnina's fake fur coat and hat. So it seems to be a scenario where these people were scrambling for clothing wherever they could find it. It was a frantic situation. So this was the crime scene that the investigators encountered when they arrived. It took 2 months to find all 9 bodies, and several months beyond that to begin to piece together theories and explanations of what had happened. Nobody knew what to make of it. What on earth could possibly wreak such havoc and yet not leave a trace of solid evidence? What could crush a man's skull? What could impale 2 women's chests without leaving any trace or any evidence of a weapon? Early on in the investigation, many of the Soviets suspected that the death was the result of an attack by the local Mansi tribesmen. They actually thought that these people, the native people who lived there, were the aggressors who killed these hikers. However, the Masi people are known even now to be very peaceful people, and there's never been any record of anything like this. And there was also no evidence of other individuals having interacted with these campers and killed them. There was no evidence whatsoever that the Masi people were there that night. Others suspected that the hikers may have been killed by an avalanche. However, there's no evidence of this either. The snow drifts do not line up with any evidence of an avalanche. A third theory was that an argument broke out between the campers themselves and that things got out of hand and they began to attack one another. And this explains some of the lack of clothing. They theorized that this situation might have possibly been related to a romantic encounter that could have caused some sort of jealousy or conflict, resulting in the team splitting up into groups and going in different directions, and therefore bodies being found in 3 separate locations. But the skiers wouldn't have been able to cause the massive injuries that were found on the bodies. Again, skull fracture, chest being cratered in, and tongues and eyeballs being removed from one body. There was just no evidence of that being caused by anybody within the party. So as the causes of death remained a mystery, more and more theories began to crop up, and people began to say that the hikers were killed by some sort of a Russian Yeti. And this is probably still to this day one of the most popular theories. It accounts for the immense force and power that was used to cause the injuries of 3 of the students. And it lines up with eyewitness accounts of strange happenings in that area at other points in time. Allegedly, a piece of paper was found written in the diary of one of the hikers at the site that is said to have read, "We now know that Icemen exist." That's it. They don't know which of the hikers wrote it, but it was scrawled allegedly on a piece of paper found near one of the diaries, and that's all it said. "We now know that Icemen exist." Others have said that it read, "We now know that Icemen are real." In any case, this is an apocryphal story. It has never been confirmed absolutely, but if it is true, it would lend further support to this idea of the Yeti. Iceman is the Russian term for what we would call the Yeti, or a Bigfoot-type creature. So if this story can be believed, then these campers were attacked by some unknown giant hominid, and that would account for the blunt force trauma and the brutal nature of their deaths. Another strange component, though, that can't be overlooked is that reports of slight radiation around the bodies were found, and that was a curveball. That's an anomaly that nobody would have expected. The Army actually discovered this, and when they found this, they began to propose theories of what could possibly be the culprit, and the theory that they settled on was radioactive weapon exposure. Perhaps the Soviet government was testing military-grade weapons in the area, and these unfortunate hikers just happened to be at ground zero at the time of the weapon test, and that's what ultimately led to their deaths. However, again, the strange nature of the deaths don't seem to line up with a missile attack, for example. So this is a hard one to put a lot of credence into. However, if it was some sort of military activity, whether it be misidentification of hostiles or something much more nefarious and dark, the government's not going to own up to that and admit it. You can assure yourself. But in any case, the Soviets did deny this. They said that there was no missile testing or any other sort of military activity going on in that area at the time. But there are alleged accounts from other hikers in the area, and by in the area, approximately 50 kilometers, so roughly 35 to 40 miles away, who claim to see strange lights or orbs in the sky in that direction that night. So they claim to see orange lights moving toward Kholat Syakhl. So this is the area that the hikers were camping, and if this can be believed, there was some sort of activity that could not be explained going on in the skies above them that evening. The chief investigator of the Dyatlov Pass incident, a man by the name of Lev Ivanov, he actually said in 1990, so much later after this incident had been put on the back burner, he said, quote, "I suspected at the time, and I am almost certain of it now, that these bright flying spheres had a direct connection to the group's death," end quote. But still, to this day, no one knows with any level of certainty what happened at Dyatlov Pass. No one knows. So let's put the fingerprints on the table. Let's look at what we know. We know that this was an area that the local people said had strange, paranormal even activity going back as far back as they could recount their history. We know that there have been stories of yetis and giant hominid creatures in this area. We know that there have been accounts of strange sightings in the sky, strange lights in the sky. We know that the locals call this place the Mountain of the Dead, and apparently there are spirits who dwell under the mountain, quote, under the mountain, and that they live in this area and they protect this area from outsiders. And if we go back and we examine our ancient fingerprints, we know that Herodotus said that the mysterious people of Hyperborea lived in this area, the Ural Mountains, and that they protected their land. They stayed independent for as long as possible, and they even had dwellings underground. This is what the ancient sources tell us. And now, 1959, nearly 2,500 years later, a group of hikers led by Igor Dyatlov venture in to the Ural Mountains, not knowing what awaits them, expecting to find only snow-capped peaks, and instead they meet something far stranger and far more frightening than anything they could have expected to encounter on that trip. And they ultimately meet their fate in the manner that I've already described. What do we do with that evidence? What do the fingerprints tell us? When I mentioned at the end of part 1 that I would propose a theory that draws a parallel between the modern day and the tales of Herodotus, this is what I was alluding to. The Dyatlov Pass incident, ground zero for the strangest murder mystery of the 20th century. I think that if we examine the evidence, there is strong reason to believe that what the ancient authors wrote about 2,500 years ago may very well exist, even if it's just as a small remnant in this area of the world. If you look at a map of the Asian continent, you will see that the landmass of Russia is larger than any other in the world. That if a civilization of people wanted to disappear in the Ural Mountains, it would not be difficult to do so. And it would be even easier if they had decided at some point in the distant past to make their primary dwellings underground. So I'm proposing that the most logical theory and the best explanation of what happened at Dyatlov Pass is that some race or some individual who descended from this race who lived off the grid and maybe distantly related or directly related to these Hyperborean people, dwelled in the Ural Mountains as recently as 1959 and may still dwell there today. And in an effort to protect their sacred ground, this individual or group of individuals attacked Igor Dyatlov and his companions and ultimately murdered them that night. I think the strange lights could be explained as some sort of technology that maybe we don't understand. Something, again, Admiral Byrd's diary mentions and many, many other encounters over the years mention as UFO or USO, unidentified submerged object technology, seems to indicate, which is that there are crafts and advanced devices in this world that we know nothing of, that our government cannot explain, that other governments cannot explain, and yet still exist. I think that this may lend credence to that perhaps these underground civilizations, if they are really there, may be responsible for some of this activity. It would account for so many stories about flying orbs shooting out of the sea or shooting into the sea or diving into caverns and caves, disappearing below the horizon. We hear these stories all the time, and many in the UFO community always assume that these are extraterrestrials coming from outer space, and others assume that perhaps these are just, government machines that are top secret and have never been revealed to the public. But we know now that our own government is researching these things. Why would they be doing that if they were their own devices, if they were their own aircraft? Neither of those explanations seem to be the most plausible. It seems to me that there's a third party at play here. So why can't that third party be these Hyperboreans? You've heard the myths of Atlantis. You've heard the myths of advanced civilizations countless times over the years who claim to be so advanced that the rest of the world could not compete with them or understand their technology, but yet in some Shakespearean way they ultimately meet their doom. Well, perhaps a remnant of these people still exists. Perhaps they went underground. I mean, that zeitgeist, that narrative has not died down. It's just as popular as ever. I mean, the movie Aquaman's about to hit theaters right now, and what's that a story of? It's a story of a superhero demigod, basically, who is the heir to the throne of Atlantis, which is still a thriving civilization deep beneath the sea. I mean, it's fantasy, of course, but it's a narrative that people have always kind of held on to in the back of their mind. Well, why do we hold on to that? Because we know that there's always a possibility that it could be true. The vast majority of our seas remain unexplored, and almost the entirety of our subterranean cavernous lands also remain unexplored. I think that the Dyatlov Pass incident is the smoking gun that links us back to some of the fantastical accounts that we received from Herodotus and his contemporaries. I think that the history we were never taught is the key to solving one of the greatest mysteries of the 20th century. So when you go online, when you look at a picture of Igor Dyatlov and his companions as they venture out into the Ural Mountains on their expedition, not knowing what awaits them, I want you to look at their faces, look at the environment, look at the scenario, realize how it's not so far removed from the time that you and I inhabit right now, this space-time in which we live. And I want you to entertain the idea that this group, before they would take their last breath just a few days after these photos were taken, they would come face to face with the realization that the history we were taught, the history we were exposed to growing up, was only a half-truth. And something far darker, something far ominous, something far more mysterious was out there, waiting to be discovered, or perhaps waiting to discover them. And they would find out firsthand, in the most unfortunate of circumstances, just how real that history is. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that episode. I said at the beginning of part 1 that there would be a drawing announced at the conclusion of this 2-part series, and that drawing was for an opportunity to win a copy of Herodotus, the Histories. And several of you did submit your names. I got the email notification, so thank you for all of the support there. Thank you for those of you who went out and left us a 5-star review and took the time to notify me of your desire to be entered into this drawing. Of the handful of names that we received for consideration, I did select one randomly, and the winner of that drawing is Mr. Jeff Larson. So, Jeff, if you would like to message me with your shipping details, any information I need to get that book over to you, I will get it out to you right away. But I need you to contact me first with your information. So please do, and congratulations. I will write you a little personal note on the inside cover, and hopefully you enjoy reading through the histories of Herodotus as much as I did, and that it is an enlightening experience. I said this before, but reading Herodotus for me was like going from looking at history in black and white to looking at it in living color. It gave me so much more clarity and transparency into a world that I thought was completely untouchable and incomprehensible. And to an extent, it obviously is and always will be, but it just made that world alive for me. And not only the world of Herodotus, but the world that Herodotus was born into, the world that came before him. So you learn a lot about ancient Egypt, you learn a lot about the ancient Middle East even, so it really enlightens the Bible for you as well, as far as understanding the dynamic between so many of these cultures. It's just fascinating. So if you don't have your hands on a copy of Herodotus, and if you're a reader and a studier, please get your hands on a copy of it. Jeff, I'll be sending you a copy, but all of the rest of you, if you haven't read it, it's well worth your time. As I said, this was a 2-part segment, so this will be the last of it. We will venture back into this territory again, I'm sure, at some point down the road, but for now, we'll be moving on to other topics. If you guys have your own theories or thoughts about it, whether you have any thoughts about the Hyperboreans, other things we covered in Herodotus in part 1, the situation at Dyatlov Pass and the unsolved murder mystery there, or Admiral Byrd and his mysterious diary, happy to dialogue with you about it anytime. Shoot me an email, josh@joshuawisely.com. That's josh@joshuawisely.com. You can link to that in the show notes. You can also check out our website if you want to learn more. That's joshuawisely.com. Get more information about the podcast at fringeradionetwork.com. And I hope you guys have your curiosity piqued, if nothing else. This was a fun one to research because I remember having that eureka moment as I was reading Herodotus, thinking, this sounds really familiar. This sounds like something I read about in much more contemporary times. And the fingerprints, in my opinion, are there. But if you agree, if you disagree, let me know either way, and I'd love to have a conversation with you guys. So be on the lookout for more content in the future. We're coming up on the end of the year here. Thank you all for a wonderful and prosperous year. It's been awesome to see our subscriber base grow, a number of Patreon supporters grow, and just a number of people engaging with the podcast. So I occasionally post updates and helpful information and just resources that I think are interesting. Over on Facebook, if you want to check us out there, I know Facebook isn't the forum that it used to be, but we still do get some engagement there. And I spend a little bit of time there. I'm not a huge social media guy, but if you want to chat, you can always find me on Facebook at Eschaton Podcast. We also have a private discussion group called the Eschaton Discussion Group, which you can link to through the Facebook page if you'd like to join that. It's about 75 to 100 of us in there, and people occasionally post things related to the subject matter of the show or something that just might be of interest otherwise. So feel free and come and join the dialogue there. And you guys can always reach me through email or directly. It's been really cool to chat with some of you on the phone and to be able to get to know you that way as well. So thank you once again to all of our patrons and all of our supporters for sustaining this show and for helping us grow and continue to advertise. It's a huge blessing to have people who think that this show is worth supporting and worth listening to. So I hope you guys will continue to stick with us in 2019. We've got some exciting things lined up for the new year and hoping to get some additional guests on as well. My buddy Dave will be back early on in 2019. We'll continue our conversation about man camp and manhood and so many other interesting things on that front. Hoping to get my buddy Daniel Hungerford back on the show. So a few familiar faces as well as some celebrities, quote unquote, within the genre, as well as some familiar names and voices. So stick around, and I hope you guys enjoy what you hear and that 2019 is even better than 2018 has been. You guys may hear from me one more time before the end of this year and before we close the books on 2018, but whether you do or whether you don't, be happy, be healthy, be well, everybody. Enjoy the new year, and I'll see you right back here soon again next time on Eschaton. Take care, everybody.
And anytime you introduce fear into a logical process, whether it's linear, spherical, or otherwise, you're going to distort things.